Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Today we're looking at a creature type, and that creature type is Eldrazi. Eldrazi are some of the biggest and bombiest creatures in Magic's history, and as a result, despite them being a relatively new creature type in Magic compared to, say, goblins or merfolk, they have already made their mark on the game. In this video, we're going to talk about the 10 Eldrazi who have had the biggest impact on competitive Magic's history. Just a quick reminder on how I score things. Pro Tour top 8s, this also includes Legacy and Vintage Championship events, are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix top 8 is worth 1 point. So let's start at number 10. At number 10, we have Catacomb Sifter. Not exactly what you think of when you think Eldrazi, but the second time we went to Zendikar, Wizards gave us some smaller Eldrazi to play with, which ended up being a pretty huge mistake for some older formats, but more on that later, and many of them were just really good in Standard too. Catacomb Sifter is 3 mana for 3/4 worth of stats and can even ramp you if that's what you're looking for. Oh, and it also happens to let you scry every single time a creature dies. Because why not have even more value? Because of all the value it gave you when creatures die, it was a key card in decks built around sacrificing and going wide. Oh, and it happened to have a low enough converted mana cost that you could grab it with Collected Company. All of this resulted in this being a pretty great card for Standard, showing up first in Rally the Ancestors decks, and then showing up in the aforementioned Collected Company decks, as well as the Sacrifice-centric Eldrazi Aristocrats deck. Near the end of its time in Standard, even after Rally and Collected Company had long rotated, it continued to find its way into any decks that were black-green because of its sheer efficiency. This included Golgari Energy and Golgari Constrictor. Unlike the other Eldrazi on this list, Catacomb Sifter only ever saw play in Standard, but it isn't a complete stretch to think about it showing up in Modern at some point. At number 9, we have more of what we think of when we think of an Eldrazi, a huge creature with an epic-sounding name, and that is Endless One. It's a pretty simple design, just a creature that costs X mana and is exactly that big. Turns out that is pretty good though, when that mana can be mana of any color. It first saw play in Standard in the +1/+1 counter-centric Hardened Scales decks, where it entered the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter, so it was extra efficient, but that's all the play it saw in Standard, amounting to only 2 Grand Prix top 8s. Where it really shined was in Modern, where the printing of new lower mana costed Eldrazi resulted in a completely broken format in February and March of 2016, a time commonly referred to as Eldrazi Winter. What went wrong was that there had previously been 2 lands printed that made it easier to cast Eldrazi spells. The older Eldrazi all had prohibitive mana costs, so these didn't really see much play. But these new Eldrazi, like Endless One, well, making them cheaper was insane. These lands were, of course, Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple, both of which could effectively allow you to cast a 5/5 Endless One on turn 2, and you can see that it quickly gets out of hand after that. Eye of Ugin had to be banned in Modern to put an end to this deck's dominance, but not before Endless One, and some of his other friends who also made this list, tore up the format, putting up 5 Pro Tour top 8s at Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch, and showing up in multiples at every Modern Grand Prix in March of 2016 before the banning. Turns out that the Modern Eldrazi deck, when Eye of Ugin was legal, was strong enough to just see play in Legacy 2, where the Eye remains unbanned, and Endless One has managed to put up 3 points in that format as well, where it is likely to continue to see some play. At number 8, we have another massive Eldrazi. This one apparently capable of breaking worlds, and that is, of course, Worldbreaker. 7 mana for a 5/7 with reach that eats an artifact, enchantment, or land when it comes into play is pretty nice. It can even come back from your graveyard if you want to do it all over again. In Standard, it saw play in Gruul Ramp, T-Merge, Delirium Ramp, Gruul Energy, and, most recently, Aetherworks Marvel before that deck got banned. In Modern, it has also seen play, first, in completely broken Eldrazi aggro decks that existed when both Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin were legal in Modern, and more recently in Eldrazi Tron decks, which run the remaining Eldrazi land along with the Tron lands and are able to ramp into big Eldrazi pretty powerfully. Being able to play the Breaker on turn 4 is pretty devastating, and this guy's going to keep breaking worlds as time goes on in Modern, as long as the Tron lands are around. After a couple of more traditional Eldrazi, huge, scary-looking things, we return to another smaller one. Of course, this one can reshape matter, so we probably shouldn't take it too lightly either. While it doesn't have a huge body, Matter Reshaper pays you back with efficiency. There's basically no way to interact with this card and come out ahead, as anytime it dies, it either draws you a card or even puts a permanent on the battlefield, because why not? It was good in Standard, especially in Emerge decks that played creatures like Elder Deep Fiend, another Eldrazi, not one that made the list though, and could sacrifice the Reshaper to cast the Fiend more cheaply while also getting value out of its death trigger. It also saw play in some more aggressive Eldrazi strategies in Standard, namely in Mono White Eldrazi. Like Endless One saw play during Eldrazi Winter, putting up a ton of top 8s during that time. Unlike Endless One, and like Worldbreaker, Mana Reshaper has actually survived the banning of Eye of Ugin and still sees play in Eldrazi Tron decks, which again run the Tron lands along with Eldrazi Temple. It also sees some play in Legacy Eldrazi decks. At number 6, we have another smaller Eldrazi in Eldrazi Displacer. Like the Reshaper though, this does some powerful stuff to compensate for its smaller body. It allows you to exile creatures for 3 mana and then return them to the battlefield tapped. This is an incredibly flexible and powerful ability because it can allow you to do something simple, like keep your opponent's creatures from being able to attack you, or do more complex things, like abuse your other creatures enter the battlefield triggers. It was commonly played in Collected Company decks, which are packed full of creatures with enter the battlefield triggers, and in mono-white Eldrazi and Standard. It found its way into Modern too, of course, but it didn't play the same starring role that the other cards did in the decks of Eldrazi Winter, not appearing in any of the Pro Tour versions of the deck and only picking up 6 points in Modern while Eye of Ugin was legal. But it has survived in Modern past the banning and actually seen more success, finding its way into Death and Taxes and Eldrazi aggro. Unlike some of the others on their list, Eldrazi Displacer has even proven powerful enough for Vintage, managing top 8s in Eldrazi aggro decks in Magic's most powerful format. At number 5, we have another big scary Eldrazi, and the first legendary one to make this list. Emrakul didn't show up on Zendikar with the other Eldrazi, instead waiting to make her reappearance on the plane of Innistrad, where she was printed as a pretty ridiculous card. A 13 mana 13/13 isn't great, but it wasn't that hard to make this cost 6 or 7 mana, since it could reduce its cost by card types in the graveyard, and it gave you a pseudo Mindslaver effect. Sure, they tried to power it down by making it so that your opponent got to take a turn again before you did, but you could still fire off all of their spells on the wrong targets, attack creatures into Emrakul, and generally wreak havoc. On top of all of that, she is incredibly difficult to block thanks to flying and trample, and not that easy to kill thanks to protection from instants. Generally, if you got to control their turn, you could use up any instance that might kill her, and she would quickly end the game after that. She was completely busted in Standard, being a key card in Golgari Delirium, a deck that could rapidly fill the graveyard with cards and make Emrakul really cheap. So she was already really good. Then they printed another busted card, Aetherworks Marvel, which allowed you to play Emrakul as early as turn 4 pretty consistently. Emrakul got banned in January of 2017, and Aetherworks Marvel did later that same year. That round of bannings was sort of the beginning of this crazy year of bannings we've had in the last year, with the most recent ones being the bannings of the energy cards and the Ramunap Red cards. Anyway, Emrakul is good enough that she has even seen some play in Vintage and Modern, so she's not done just because of a silly banning in Standard. At number 4, we have, well, also Emrakul in her original appearance. Also a very powerful card. This Emrakul gives you an extra turn if you cast it, couldn't be countered, had protection from colored spells, could fly, and had Annihilator 6. She did cost 15 mana, but every time she attacked, your opponent had to sacrifice 6 of their permanents. All of that basically meant, just like with the Promised End, that if you could cast her, you basically just won the game. 15 mana is a lot, and unlike the Promised End, she can't reduce her cost, and as a result, she didn't really see any play in Standard, only managing a single Grand Prix top 8 in a Polymorph deck and a World's top 8 in an Eldrazi Ramp deck. However, decks in Modern, especially Tron decks, found ways to cast her, and still other Modern decks started to play her, realizing that you didn't have to cast her to win a lot of games. Sure, the cast trigger is nice, but 15 damage plus Annihilator 6 is pretty great, even for one swing, and decks began cheating Emrakul into play with cards like Through the Breach and Goryo's Vengeance. These are the type of Modern decks where she still sees play today. Legacy decks can cheat her into play even more effectively, and as a result, this is her primary home these days, with cards like Sneak Attack and Show and Tell, where she is one of the primary creatures, along with Gristlebrand, that the Sneak and Show deck tries to cheat into play early. At number 3, we have one of the most infamous Eldrazi from our return to Zendikar, Reality Smasher. This thing sports crazy good stats for 5 mana and is always a 2-for-1 if you want to kill it, since if your opponent targets it, they have to discard an additional card, or that ability or spell is countered. Reality Smasher was scary enough in Standard where it showed up in a variety of decks. This ranged from ramp decks to control decks, where it could be a win condition, to emerge decks, and even served as a top curve in some of the early versions of Ramunap Red aggro before it rotated out of Standard. It was one of the most busted cards to see play in the Eldrazi Winter deck, since you could conceivably play it on turn 2 with the help of your 2 Eldrazi lands and a Simian Spirit Guide. It smashed a lot of realities there, managing to show up in all 6 versions of the Eldrazi aggro deck that top 8'd Pro Tour, both with the Gatewatch, and putting up several subsequent GP top 8s in the month before before Eye of Ugin got banned. However, it is a card that has continued to see play in less busted versions of the Eldrazi deck in Modern, in both ramp and aggro variants, and it has also seen play in the Legacy and Vintage versions of the deck, where Eldrazi's Temple and Eye of Ugin are still busted. At number 2, we have another legendary Eldrazi, this time Ulamog the Ceaseless Hungerer. Like most powerful Eldrazi, it does something powerful when you cast it. In this case, Ulamog eats 2 permanents. He also happens to be a 10/10 that is indestructible and mills 20 cards at a time. Yeah, he's really hungry. In Standard, it found its way into ramp decks and teamed up with Emrakul in decks running Aetherworks Marvel, and temporarily fully replaced Emrakul in the time between when she was banned and Aetherworks Marvel was banned. Turns out playing this guy on turn 4 is almost as good as playing Emrakul on turn 4. In Modern, like many of the big Eldrazi on this list, it has found its way into Eldrazi-tron, where it is one of the deck's primary win conditions. It hasn't really found its way into Legacy or Vintage yet, which on most lists wouldn't be unusual, but on this list it's a little bit surprising because Eldrazi decks are powerful enough for the Eternal formats right now, but Ulamog hasn't found his way there yet. And at number 1, we have Thought-Knot Seer. I knew this card was nuts, I knew it would make the list, but when I thought about making this top 10, I expected Ulamog or one of the Emrakuls to be number 1. Nope, it's Thought-Knot Seer. It doesn't sport the huge body and gaudy Enter the Battlefield trigger that other Eldrazi do, but it brings some respectable stats with a powerful disruptive effect that allows you to exile your opponent's best card from their hand. Most effects like that give your opponent the card back after the creature dies, but not the Seer. Instead, your opponent just gets to draw a card, which will almost certainly be a worse card than whatever you exiled. Thought-Knot Seer has been a key card in Eldrazi aggro decks in basically all formats, and due to its cheap cost can be played incredibly quickly and disrupt your opponent's plan very early. Like Reality Smasher, it was in all 6 of the decks that top 8'd Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch, and has lived on in the Eye of Ugin list variants of the deck, while also seeing play in Legacy and especially in Vintage Eldrazi, where it has 4 Vintage Championship top 8s, which is a pretty impressive feat. Thought-Knot Seer doesn't seem super likely to relinquish its position on top of the list anytime soon, thanks to how much it is played in Eternal formats. Well, that does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, check out my Patreon in the description below. Thanks for watching.